You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Bill Schultheiss of Toole Design to talk about bike-friendly design guides. We take a look at the benefits of both AASHTO and NACTO guides and discuss the importance of history, political will, and the stress of being an expert witness in a trial. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super wonderful, terrific, amazing Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of city wizards and transportation experts, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. We've also got some bonus material up there, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, the heavyweight net bike scarf is back in stock. I'm also going to make a concerted effort to make some new designs, but if you want to get one of the Buster Bike scarves or the Lightweight Bike scarf now, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. And if you'd like to support the show in other ways, you can buy books at the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire, or find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarcholesterol. For anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook, visit theoverheadwire.com and definitely sign up for the almost 20-year-old daily newsletter. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can also find us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. Some great stuff coming up, so keep on listening and enjoy the show. A quick note for Patreon supporters. I've set up an ad-free podcast RSS feed at Patreon. This means if you want to listen to the show without ads or promotional episodes in your podcatcher of choice, you can do so by heading over to your Patreon account and getting the feed there. I'll post instructions in the show notes of how to do it. And if you aren't a Patreon supporter, you can do so by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Even just $1 a month gets you our podcast free of outside ads. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Bill Schultheiss, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Really pumped to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm our Director of Design and Engineering at Toole Design Group. I'm a partner at Toole Design, and I've been with Toole for 23 years. I'm a civil engineer. I went to school in Boston at Northeastern University, grew up in Vermont, in a pretty small rural city. We called it a city, 5,000 people. It felt big growing up there until I moved to Boston and realized what big really was. So yeah, I've been involved in this space for quite a while and I've seen a lot of changes. And I think it's been really fun to be part of a profession that's been changing, I think, for the better. It's been pretty rewarding.
What's the thing that got you interested in transportation? Like, was it something that happened when you were a little kid, or was it something that happened when you were in college? Like, where was that kind of genesis?
I feel like I might be the classic little kid that watched them repave the street and was just watching the paving trucks and thought that was super cool. And I distinctly remember that, actually. And then when they came in and out of the sidewalk to the street, and then they upgraded the stormwater pipe adjacent to our property. And they were big, impactful moments as a kid that you don't realize, but they stick with you. But then you don't know what you're doing. I got a daughter that's a junior in high school and trying to figure out her future. Now it's put me back remembering what it's like for me and how hard that is. Like, how do you imagine what you want to do the rest of your life? You can't know because you need to try things. And like, until you do it, you're really not sure. So anyway, I was in high school and I had a shop teacher who was awesome. And I was like, hey, I think I love woodworking. He said, it's great. It's a great field, but you might rather do what my brother's doing. And he's a civil engineer. You'll have a lot more stability financially and just with your career. So I took his advice and I applied to engineering school and got accepted. But even then, my first year in college, I didn't know. I was like mechanical engineer, industrial, civil. It's kind of all over the place. And I think it's a reason I chose Northeastern. It was a co-op school, so you got to work. So your freshman year, you go full time and then you get a summer off. And then after that, the next 4 years alternates, full-time school, full-time work. Well, the full-time work gig was great because I got to work for a contractor. I got to work for a public works agency. I worked for consultants. So I got to try different things. And it was through that process I realized that I really liked consulting. Then I graduated and got a job as a consultant. So I've been a consultant ever since. So I think it worked out. I feel very fortunate that it worked out. I've seen a lot of people change careers as they get older, but I've really enjoyed this work.
That's interesting about the co-op thing. I had a friend who went to Georgia Tech and then ended up going to Austin every summer and living with me because he was working at Dell Computer for that summer. And I wish we'd had that more for like planning and things like that, where we had to, and I did some internships and stuff, but I think the co-op system is a little bit different in that way, where you kind of actually get in the weeds, learning what the company's doing and actually, having some experience when you get out of school.
Oh, way more. I mean, yeah, you can work in the summer for 8 weeks or whatever it is, but I worked full time for 6 months straight. You really got into things at that scale in a way that you can't in 8 weeks. And then the repetitive nature that every year you were in this cycle of it. Yeah, it kept advancing. So by the time I came out, I'd already worked 2 years full time and did a lot of things where I watch some entry level kids come in now without that experience. And they're quite a bit further behind than I was coming out of college. So it's super valuable, but it's also not common. It adds time to the schedule, and there's not very many co-op schools in the U.S.
So then how do you get into active transportation? Like, what is the point when you start thinking about bikes and everything else that goes along with that?
And again, I think as a kid, you have these moments. Again, I grew up in St. Albans, Vermont, this big city, but then I got a job. I always tell this story when I do trainings, but I got a job so I could buy a car so I could get around, because as in a car-dependent community, we could bike and walk in the city, but then it was hard to get around. So the irony is I had to get a job to buy the car to be able to do things, and then all my free time was working at the job to pay for the car. And I was making $3 an hour, like minimum wage. Then it took forever to make enough money to pay for that car. It's kind of a shame. And that was a moment that really hurt me. Like, my friends are going out doing fun things as a senior year in high school, and I was like, I was working. It's fine to work and do that, but you start to really know what car culture is and the cost of it, but you don't know it in the moment. But now I have all these eyes looking back. I gave up a lot of time that I can't get back at a unique moment in your life where you get to really experience things in a different way, right? Because you don't have a job, you don't have full-time school. So I think that was a taste of it, but I still didn't know, right? So I go to college and I try the co-op thing and I get out. I end up getting into wastewater. So I was doing sewer work, stormwater repair. I did that for 4 years. That wasn't as rewarding as doing what I'm doing now, surface transportation. And it was because it's invisible, right? It's important, but people don't see it. And I remember like working late one night to get this report in for the client. I get it to them, and the client didn't read it. There was no public feedback. No one cared. The work mattered, but it was kind of in its own thing. So I was getting a little discouraged that maybe this wasn't a fulfilling career. And that's when I met Jennifer and switched to come to Toole, got into transportation, and then the rewards that our professions get frustrated by it, but working with the public, but honestly, work in a profession where there's no feedback, and that's not rewarding either. So I'll take the criticism and the negative feedback in a public meeting, because it's great to be engaged with a community to advance it. People don't always agree on how to do it, but it's super rewarding to be able to do something that impacts everybody, that people care about. That was really the big thing, I think, for me, transitioning and realizing that this is really the space I wanted to be in, is transportation.
It's so interesting because people do depend on water infrastructure and the pipes and everything else, but it's mostly, like you said, it's not seen, as opposed to transportation where everybody experiences it every day. The invisibility of the water infrastructure everybody experiences, but they're not like traveling with other people in buses or bikes or in cars on the road or anything like that. And so it's interesting to think about how nobody probably has that much of an opinion about water infrastructure, but everybody has an opinion about transportation infrastructure, right?
Everybody. And like, of course you have an opinion about water when it breaks and it doesn't work or it's dirty, but yeah, it's invisible. And I think that's why things like in Flint, Michigan can persist for decades. The pollution and the problems with that, where a surface transportation issue gets elevated to the governor's desk and it's dealt with generally, right? So I think it's a great space to be in, to have a big impact on society. And I think it can be for good, can also be for bad. But I think by and large at Toole, we have a really good impact on the communities we're working in.
Well, so I want to dive into kind of, before we get talking about the guides and all the stuff that we're going to chat about, I do want to go kind of back in time and think about cycling as a mode of transportation and this idea of creating space for cyclists from when it started up until now. And so what was the switch that led to like more advocacy towards creating spaces for people to bike and maybe walk around their neighborhoods?
I've gotten big into the history of bikeway design. I kind of got into that through this process, but I've even thought about it on my own experience of evolving as like the little kid in town, St. Albans. Biked around was huge, right? Just to be able to, the freedom you get from that. But then how that freedom was limited because I didn't have space on the busy road. So there were places I couldn't go, wasn't allowed to go. And then I go to college and I'm biking to class and biking around Boston, real intense traffic. And that was a point in my life where I was a teenage male and really confident, overconfident, really. But I was in there racing cars and, feeling the thrill of being in traffic. And, that was a unique experience. And then I got into bike racing out of that. And that was super fun. And then I come to work and I realized, like, yeah, that's a perspective, but also, like, think back to when you were a kid, you couldn't go to these places. That's what I've watched occur over my 23 years at Toole, is how the industry itself has recognized, like, we should be really thinking about children and they need space on the road. We should be thinking about the people who aren't really excited to be racing cars and be in with cars and they need separate space. So that's just been a fascinating conversation to be part of the last 23 years. What I learned on the AASHTO Bike Guide project was that, it's a new conversation for me. I just came into this, but like, this is actually a conversation that's been going on since the late 60s. So there's other generations and other moments of this sort of argument of how do we organize our street space. It goes back to the mid 60s when it comes to bike infrastructure.
And what was that conversation like at the time? And at that time and a little bit later was this huge discussion about vehicular cycling and the somewhat of a schism between what that is versus what we were talking about now.
Yeah, I've always been interested in history. So I've been working in the field long enough to know that there's a tension between a part of the advocacy community that felt any bikeway was unsafe and eliminating the right to the road, and versus huge segment of the population that just felt like they'd been ignored and marginalized and wanted space on the roads. So I looked into that history, and it goes back to the 60s. It goes back to the first bike lane in Davis, California, where the professor at Davis said, hey, we should be a bike-friendly campus. Went to Europe, I can't remember which country, it might have been the Netherlands or Copenhagen, either way, but said, hey, there's a different way to do this, and it's creating separate space for vulnerable users that's more comfortable and it's safer. And so they piloted a network of bike lanes in the city of Davis in the late 60s into the early 70s. They had support of the federal government, it supported the California DOT. They did it, they studied it, and they found that, yeah, that's true. These things are safer, better, people like them. It was fascinating. And so then you now have this pilot community that did this, the results were positive, and then the next step is, well, okay, let's scale it up. And that's when the schism started. And that's when a new form of bike advocacy started that said, well, no, hold on a minute. We don't want to do that. That's dangerous. It's not safe. You're restricting my rights to the road. And it started this vehicular cycling movement. And I think movement's a good word for it because they were quite successful. And it launched in the mid 70s and really held sway up until the mid 2000 to 2010 timeline. Quite a long period of dominance, I think, in the professional and advocacy space.
That's really interesting. Something just popped in my head just listening to you talk. I've been thinking a lot about the oil crisis in the 70s and how kind of that put Europe and the United States on somewhat different trajectories when it comes to transportation planning. Thinking about, obviously, there's Kindermort and the stuff that happened with children fighting back for their rights in Europe, but there's, also this kind of discussion about when, kind of we split, which was the oil crisis, the embargo and things like that. And I'm wondering if this vehicular cycling movement, and if you've thought about this as one of the things that kind of, in addition to the oil embargo, in addition to some of these different decisions that we made, that time period seems like a place in time which the split was very noticeable and it happened. And then we went our separate directions. And now here we are today in 2025.
I've thought about it a lot because you realize we're approaching 60 years now, country we'd be living in if we made different decisions then. So I don't want to give too much credit to the vehicular cycling movement of opposing this change. I think there's moments they get beat up like, oh, they've eliminated all progress in the U.S. I think it was a confluence of a few things. Yeah, we had the oil crisis and the government was on board, the federal government was on board, the states There was this push to create a multimodal system. And then we had this kind of stagflation issues in the late 70s where we were kind of limited on money. And then Reagan came into power. We had this total shift of the political dynamic of cheap oil, and that stuff's communism if you're doing that. We're about being individuals and less about working together as a society to solve problems and more about the individual doing things. I think it was all that together that caused the outcome we're in today of dealing with some of these problems from them, of a very car dependent culture, where in the 70s they had the child safety crisis. And then I was like, no, we need to solve this. So they came together as a culture, like, that's a terrible thing. Like, kids shouldn't die. Let's do something about it. And they did. It wasn't that they didn't have conflicts about it or disagreements about it, but they, by and large, as a group, said, hey, we're going to solve it. And they did. They solved it. Where we just have not shown the capability thus far to say that transportation safety crisis is something we want to solve. We're reaching still at all-time highs today, which is just astonishing to me, and it's heartbreaking. But there's the changing voices that we do need to solve it. But I think we're still not in a place where there's an all-in. We're all in as a society to do the things we need to do to improve and address the safety crisis and the climate crisis, clearly. It's been, I think, really helpful to have those words, all ages and abilities. I think AASHTO did a great job, I think, of kind of the whole transportation profession to shift in that direction, because it's a little easier to understand. You can wrap your head around it, and it's a little hard to debate it as like a bad idea. I think people can agree, regardless of their politics or where they're coming from, that people should be able to get around, should be safe, should be accessible to everybody. So it's very inclusive. And I think that's been helpful in getting the shift, which we see now, of like people saying, recognizing protected bike lanes are better than sharrows or things like that, that we recognize now that there's a difference in performance of different types of facilities to get the outcomes we want. It's been nice to have the changed language that matches kind of where we're at as an industry with what are the right things to do to achieve the goals we want.
We were just talking about kind of the change over time and thinking. I'm wondering how your thinking has changed over time. You've been working on AASHTO Bike Guide for 10 years?
It's been 10 years, yeah. It's a long process. This was longer maybe than any of us wanted it to be. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. We've maybe come back to that. But I think my evolution in this has changed throughout my career. When I came to Toole, I didn't know anything about transportation. I always laugh because one of the first books I bought when I came to Toole, I was like, wow, I got to learn about bikeway design. And I bought John Forrester's book on bikeway, not really design, but vehicular cycling, because it was the only thing available really early 2000s, because the internet wasn't as big as it was. And that's what's printed. And so I think I've changed in how I've approached things, because I was that confident young man who could bike down the busy street and deal with it. And I was bike racing, and you don't have the same perspective when you have that kind of bias of, well, it's fine for me, unless you're a deeply empathetic person thinking about everything else, which I try to be, but still you can get in your box of what you're familiar with. It can affect your recommendations. And I see that with traffic engineers that like, oh, all I do is drive around in my car all the time, and every solution they have is something to make driving around easier, and they don't understand what it's like to be a pedestrian on the roads or to bike or to take transit. It really is critical to be a user of these things to understand them. And I think that's my biggest personal journey, is evolving from a bike racer to a bike just for transportation user, biking with my family, but really thinking about it from all the different perspectives and not your narrow, might be your own bias perspective, has been really impactful. And I've watched our industry get better at that. It was a very biased industry when I came into it, in my opinion, based on my experiences, where a lot of engineers weren't really interested in being helpful in making streets safer for bicycling because they personally didn't understand it. They didn't see the value in it. That's completely changed, I think, over the last 20 years, which is wonderful.
How's that change reflected in the work that you're doing for the bike guide? I mean, whenever I see AASHTO, for example, I'm just a little wary. And I think that there's a lot of us in the active transportation field who are. It might be from kind of the ways in the past that they've kind of clashed against us in transportation bill write-ups. It might be the sparring that I got into with @AASHTO Speaks on Twitter many years ago. But I'm curious, like, how the evolution is going to the point where you can get a guide where you can personally feel like it's going in the right direction.
I think it's, again, moments in time, right? So I think about sort of evolutions of processes now and how important design guidance is. So imagine you're an engineer getting out of school and it's 1970. Okay, that's great. Who are you learning from? You're learning from all the greatest, smartest thinkers on highway design that ripped through cities and just did lots of damage because that was what society said we needed to do. Those were the best and brightest were put on those projects. So those are your mentors. Okay, fast forward 30 years, and then you're going to be working in that environment for the first 10, 15 years of your career. Well, now 30 years later, what year is it? It's 2000. It's hard to believe, but that young engineer in 1970, now 2000, running an agency, is in charge, is the director of the DOD, what city, state, doesn't matter. Even consulting firm. You're now the person in charge, but you might still be bringing values from 30 years prior to your job. Lots of people evolve. Lots of us do. You learn on the job, but I think it's hard to overstate how important those first decade of your career is and what it will lead you in doing the rest of your career. So I think what I saw was a lot of resistance in the 2000s to changing design guidance because those people were from an era where this stuff was devalued. That's how you end up with a green book that says, well, you might want to consider sidewalks on an arterial street in an urban area. Well, it's a city. Shouldn't it be the other way around? The sidewalk should be mandatory in an urban area. Let's consider how many lanes of traffic we need. Like, this kind of was all backwards. It's because those were the values from the 60s that carried into the 2000s. So what I've seen is with the retirement of that generation, a huge sea change in perspective. Everyone's a lot more multimodal now. They've lived in environments where they saw the value of the multimodal system, but you had federal programs like Ice-T in 1990 that created money for bike infrastructure, for transit, for sidewalks. So the 1990s was that pivotal moment where for 10 years we started doing simple things like putting sidewalks in and like regular striped bike lanes were a big deal. Just the 5-foot bike lane on a street. And all you were doing was narrowing lanes and adding a bike lane, which led into the 2000s and 2010s where now we're talking about road diets, like removing a lane of traffic. It was very rare for lanes of traffic to be removed from any streets to be used for people biking or walking until 2010. And I think that can be hard to believe sometimes. But that's really what the environment was that we're in. Now, 2025, we're ripping lanes of traffic out all over the place and adding bus lanes, and protected bike lanes. And it's really, that's the part that's really incredible to watch. AASHTO is a volunteer organization. It's a membership-driven group, just like the Association of Pedestrian Bike Professionals. They have to represent every state DOT, and they all have their unique priorities, concerns, and interests. And I think AASHTO, their job is to represent all those perspectives. So I think they've always been in a spot where their concern might be unique in individual state DOT, but AASHTO is pulled into that conversation as well. You're that group when they're not the same. I've had many challenges with city agencies, DOTs, where they won't do things, and I see the advocates up in arms about what the city won't do or the mayor won't do. Really no different in that case between the different groups. They have different purposes, I guess.
Yeah. I just find it's interesting at this very moment in time where you see, kind of a backlash at the state legislatures. We're seeing a lot of state preemption. I mean, places like Texas and others and I've been following this pretty closely, there's states that are starting to try to outlaw the limiting of lane reductions and complete streets and all these things that we've been talking about, and they've been accelerating. And so I'm wondering if we've been so successful that now they're getting, a little bit scared about what the future might look like.
I think, like anything, change is scary. I don't care who you are. I think there's a small subset of the population like loves change, like ready to go. And I think as a guy that was big on change, when I'm watching what's happening, I'm not liking the pace of change that I'm seeing right now from the federal government. I can say that. And I think it's super unsettling. And even this administration's given me a new perspective on the pace of change and what it can cause you to feel at an individual level. So there is a bike lash going on. And I think it is a response to the fact that in every single state in this country now, you can find a protected bike lane. That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
That's just in the last 10 years. 15 years ago, NACTO, we were like people for bikes in the league were like counting them on single digits of like where they are. And that was a big deal. And now they're in every state. And now you've got urban cities in every state have bike networks. Well, that's all occurred. And I think it's that the totality of that change has led to some backlash of some sort of reactionary voices. And now you're seeing it in some of these preemption bills where they're like, outlawing road diets, outlawing bike lanes. We can't spend transportation money on sidewalks or bike lanes. And I think some of that is a reaction to some of this for sure. Some of it's this ongoing tension of what do we want to pay for? But I think a lot of it is rooted in this challenge we face that we constructed a car culture starting in the 1940s, and we went all in and spent a lot of money on that. And we did that for 80 years. And there's a lot of myth out there. You talk to the average citizen, they think, well, the gas tax pays for all this. Well, they don't. That's not the truth. So you have misinformation now that where simple sound bites can be compelling to people. Well, yeah, why should the federal government pay for a bike lane in Austin? Well, the federal government's paying for all sorts of stuff on the transportation system in Austin. I think that's the realities we're now having to have that conversation of, well, what do our taxes pay for? What is a subsidy? What's that mean? I think that's what we're seeing. So I know engineers aren't happy with these preemption bills because what we want to be able to do is solve problems. And that takes away your ability to solve problems. Even in those states where these things are happening, there's unhappiness. They know there's a safety problem. And that in some cases, in a lot of cases, these roads are overbuilt and they're unsafe as designed, and they need to be road guided to improve safety. And if that tool is taken away from you, all we're going to do is just keep the death toll up. And it's really sad. So I think this will be a moment that will change, is my hope. We'll get through it.
Yeah. So you've made changes actually between the 2012 guide and the current guide. There's been an evolution in that time period, obviously, because of what's come out. But what's the difference between 2012 and now, or the time period before 2012 when that guide was created and the time period that this guide was created in?
It's a great question. And it's one that really gets at maybe the heart of where I think there's been some folks that feel AASHTO's pretty conservative and they're not supportive of these things. And they kind of have a vehicular cycling take on things, where NACTO is embracing all ages and abilities. And I think a lot of the source of that goes back to the 2012 guide, where it was a timing issue. It was also this end point of the maybe maximum influence of the sort of vehicular cycling perspective within the DOT perspective. I worked on the last guide, and there was an inordinate perspective of vehicular cycling involved, not from the consulting team, but I think that the people that oversaw the development of the guide that had to authorize it and approve it, the committee members, brought a perspective that was, we're okay with bike lanes, the unprotected bike lanes, but these protected bike lanes are too new, they're untested, they won't work in the United States, there's very few of them, they're not ready for primetime AASHTO. And so they wouldn't let them be put in the guide, even though we actually wrote guidance for that guide, for those subjects. But we were told to take them out. And again, I think that was this moment in time where that was the way the industry was focused, the traditional industry of, if it's not out there and unproven in the US, then it can't be put in a manual. So you'd see that in the METCD, you'd see it in AASHTO. You'd see it even in local government documents. So it was a great update. I'm really proud of the work we did. Like of the content we did, it was great. And I think it was research-based as well, but we couldn't do everything we wanted to. And just as that was published, NACTO came out with their first edition of the Bikeway Guide, and that was embracing the forward-looking treatments. And it was saying, look, sure, we don't have US-based things, but like these things have been built in the world and they work. And New York City was a real leader. Portland had started it, but New York City really took the first steps of implementing some of these protected bike lanes. And New York City and Portland were the real brain trust of the beginnings of NACTO. That guide went a lot further. And because they came out about the same time, then NACTO became like the guide for progressive bikeway design. And AASHTO remained this sort of conservative, play it safe, stick with the traditional approaches guide. And then that persisted really until this publication of the new guide this year. So I think that was a big 15-year period where we were really gapped out. And AASHTO was quite far behind where the industry was at and fell further behind each year. It wasn't updated. So now they're both out. And I think what's great is the new bike guide is right there. It's a very robust, research-based best practice document that is appeared in NACTO and actually goes deeper than NACTO on many subjects. But they complement each other. They're very much in alignment, which is wonderful.
I don't have a copy, but 600 pages seems like a pretty robust tome.
Yeah. There's a lot there. And again, we cover some subject that NACTO doesn't. It's very comprehensive. And also NACTO has always been geared as more of an urban, and again, the title even, Urban Bikeway Design Guide for cities. And I think it's viewed as maybe larger cities, but I think it can be applied to any urban context, including my small town in St. Albans, Vermont. But it is for rural areas. It's for suburban areas. It's for the small towns. So it's a lot wider. It's comprehensive in what it covers. We deal a lot more with highway interchanges because DOTs build highways and they own them. So there's a lot more content on dealing with getting through some of those gnarly interchanges that, for good or ill, they exist and we got to get through them. So we provide a lot of great guidance on navigating those safer, which is going to be really crucial to improving biking in suburban areas and even some cities, since frankly, interstates exist in almost every city in the United States, where NACTO doesn't cover some of those subjects. But on the basics, the two documents are very much in alignment, which is great in urban areas.
I'd love to hear your perspective on the NACTO guide release too, because I know that folks from Toole worked on that as well as the AASHTO guide. And so I'm wondering, some of the places where they mesh, and you just talked about a couple of places where they diverge. I noticed myself that I don't think the NACTO guide actually has bridge design in it for crossing rivers and stuff like that. So they're obviously coming from different places, but they're also, like you say, many times in a number of the literature that I've read is very complementary in a way that people should have both on their desk.
That's what I say. I mean, people should have both. I think they're well developed. They have different styles. I think they can be very useful because between them, you get a lot of great information, a lot of great idea generation, but it really, as a designer, can help you implement really well done, safe bikeways. Even if you're lacking experience in doing the design, which honestly, you want to write design guidance that's accessible to those people because you'll have a bigger impact. As much as I wish Toole could design every bikeway in America, it's not going to happen. So you want to have an industry where everyone's doing the right thing and has the tools at their disposal so that you get better outcomes for everybody. I think one thing that we were able to help NACTO with is make sure that they had a stronger research basis for what they did, because we did so much work in AASHTO to make sure there was research behind as much of the recommendations as we could. That was valuable. It's super valuable. And we had this huge database of studies that we're able to share with them and help them make sure that they were equally sourced. So that's great, because where you run up against a critic, you want to make sure you've got your rationale behind it. And also you want a mistake made in guidance written in the really going back from the beginning, the 1920s all the way up to, I'd say, the 2000s. There's a lot of biased, made up guidance because there wasn't research. So when you don't have research, now you're relying on, well, what did 10 people think? Or what did we do over there? Did that work? Okay, we tried it. It's really groupthink of what we consider best practices, but it's not necessarily all great ideas because they're not based on research or based on our opinions. So our whole profession was oriented from that. So now we are really, with TRB and the funding behind research, it's so important because it's allowed us to make sure the recommendations we're putting are really solid. And then when you want to make a change, you know why you're changing. Well, the research in 1990 said this. Well, now 10 years later, it's changed, and now we know what we can update. So I think that's really huge. I think what's different, again, like we were saying, is NACTO's is much more urban, is really entirely urban focused. We got a lot of content on bike parking on the bike guide, which is great as a support system. Wayfinding, how to get on bike routes through states. And I think that you'd be shocked at how proud states are when I talk to them. There's a huge source of pride for them in having a statewide bike route that I think would surprise people, that they put a lot of pride in that and care. And that designation actually supercharges those routes as being targeted places for improvement. They want them to be safe. They know they're tourist generators. So there's things like that that are covered that are really not relevant for an AASHTO guide, that are covered at a deeper level in the AASHTO guide.
One of the things that I really appreciated about things like Wes Marshall's book was just kind of looking at some of those old research papers, or at least, hearsay of what the best practice was at the time, and then debunking it. And so, the fact that you all did that for this guide and helped NACTO do the same is really good, because I think we need to go back and look at some of those things that don't make any sense now, or they were made up by some guy who was a car company who wanted to sell more cars. Like, a lot of that stuff popped into the literature and it never should have been there in the first place, but it kind of has persisted. And, in Wes's book, he talks about how there's some parts where nobody knows exactly where it came from, but it just came out sometime and then it just was accepted as practice. And so, upending those previous norms is really important.
Well, I think and I've learned this as an engineer, and I think it was helpful for me to come to Toole, not having really been trained in transportation, having to learn it here. In working with my colleague Bob Schneider, who's a professor now at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, he really gave me the values to really care about research and to be interested in it and to want to learn so that you're fact-based. There's a study that still bothers me, but it's kicked around a lot, that a crosswalk can create a false sense of security for a pedestrian. Well, I'm like, where did this come from? Well, I found out where it came from. It came from the first pedestrian crosswalk study in the early 1970s out of San Diego. And when I read the study with the eyes of a person in 2020, with all these decades of learned experience, what I realized reading that study is that engineer in 1970 didn't understand what a multiple threat crash was and how critical that is and how foundational that is to like pedestrian safety. And so his analysis was really flawed. And so he said, well, more pedestrians were getting hit in marked crosswalks. Well, they must have had a false sense of security because more pedestrians got hit in marked crosswalks than unmarked crosswalks. Well, in San Diego, they only marked one leg of a crosswalk of an arterial, not both, at a four-leg intersection. So, of course, if you're a pedestrian, you're going to, well, of course, I go to the marked one because that must be they want me to cross. And then when I looked at the data, like something like 80 or 90% of the pedestrians were hit in the last lane of the road they were crossing. And these were all 4 and 6 lane roads. Well, you don't get all the way across the road without there being a gap in traffic. Now they're in the crosswalk and they're getting hit because drivers aren't yielding. It didn't cause a false sense of security. It was bad design, bad road design, and there was no other traffic engineering supports. But that term is I still see it now. I still hear it from engineers today that we don't want to do things to improve pedestrian safety because it'll create a false sense of security for them. I'm like, no pedestrian in San Diego had a false sense of security because of the crosswalk in 1970. They had a situation where they were not being safely accommodated on the roads. And you had a cultural problem where drivers weren't yielding. But that persists. And I see that still in design guidance and local city standards. But that's an example of how a myth, that was research-based, right? But the guy put his conclusion in, it was bad conclusion, but it was cited, and then it gets put in, and then it lives on for 50 years. And now is engineering passed down knowledge that people believe. And I ask people where did it come from. No one knows, but they just heard it. It's been passed down. So now it's just believed as truth. And it's really hard. What that's all taught me is how hard it is to unwind a myth that can get really baked into an industry and try to correct it. It's one that remains, actually. It's a huge challenge.
Yeah. I know you're steeped in the discussions about updates to the MUTCD as well. I'm wondering how these guides react to that, as well as kind of some of the consternation that maybe advocates have for that process.
Yeah, the MUTCD is an important document. I served in that committee for 15 years. It's important because it's the only document mandated in law to be used. So it creates a federal standard, and the dilemma in that is it heightens a liability standard for agencies because it's mandated in law. So if you don't follow it, all the attorneys in America, if there's a question, well, you didn't follow that thing that's mandated in law, you did it wrong, I'm going to sue, you're at fault. It creates a real challenge when that book is not meeting best practices that your hands can be tied. So we had a large period of time where the MUTCD was not updated with best practices following current research, where engineers are like, well, I can't do the thing I want to do because it's not in that book. And if I do that thing that I know is safer, then they would tell me that, I'm at more of a risk of being in trouble if something happens in court. Now, that's oversimplifying because any good engineer can document, go through a process and defend it. But the real practical matter I've learned to do an expert witness work is people don't want to be in the situation of being in court and have to testify. It's really stressful. So if their choice is take the conservative way out and just follow what's in that book of the MUTCD and I'm covered and I minimize my risk of being in court, or go beyond it, but then I got to document, justify it, it's all why I'm doing what I'm doing, even though it might be the right thing. And then I'm going to have to potentially be on a witness stand defending that. I don't want to do that. I'd say 90 out of 100 engineers would say, I'm not doing that, because we have a lot of personalities that are risk averse, but also kind of shy, conflict averse. And I'll tell you, a court setting is the most stressful, intense situation you can be in. And I don't mind it. My personality is okay with it, but it takes a lot out of you to be in the courtroom setting. And so a lot of people just will do things to avoid it, or in the hope of avoiding it.
Do you have any wild stories you can share from the courtroom?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was deposed once for 6 hours straight. I mean, I think
6 hours.
Yeah, and I got little 5-minute breaks once an hour. But the lawyers are trying to win a case. They're not trying to. I'm oversimplifying a little bit here too, but of course they want to do what's right, but ultimately they're trying to win. They're not experts in the field, so they don't care that you're an expert in the field, and they're trying to trap you into saying something so they can discredit you. And that's the part where the stress goes up. And that's what makes these engineers say, I don't want to be in that situation where you misrepresent what I'm saying. And that's actually what happened to me. In hour one of my deposition, this attorney read some statement and wouldn't tell me what the document was from that he was reading. And in hour 6 of my deposition said, oh, that document I was reading from was from your staff. He was trying to trap me into contradicting my own team, or to say that we had a bad quality control process that I'm responsible for, to then throw me out as a witness. But I was a little more wise to what he was up to. I didn't know he was reading from our document, but I just said, look, I can't give you an opinion on something when you're not telling me the source. But I've learned how to manage that process. I know what they're doing, but that's the part that is very confrontational and nerve-wracking. And that's the part that a lot of engineers just, I want nothing to do with it, because it's distasteful at a certain level.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, you can't write books for every situation or chapters for every situation that's out there. But what's missing from these guides in a perfect world that you wish there were space for?
The place people want the most help is the part where they need a lot of the decision making of, well, my scenario is constrained. You give great guidance on how to do this thing, whatever it is. Let's call it a protected intersection for the case of the story. But I don't have enough space and I got to make a compromise decision. What do I compromise? What do I trade? And what's the trade-off? That's a space that I think is continuing to evolve in our field of how to do that. And it just takes more space, more pages, like you run out of room. But it's also getting more nuanced. And our whole profession's shifting in this way. And this is what Safe Systems is about, is we've had a moment where 12-foot lane is safe, 11.9-foot wide lane, not safe. Like this very black and white idea of what's safe or not based on what meets a standard in a book, where we know that's not true. It isn't like 100% safe, 0% safe. There's a continuum. We're shifting into more of a nuanced environment where we recognize the continuum is there. At the beginning of my career, one of my first bike lanes I did in Boston was this exact argument of like, I said, do you want a bike lane on Mass Ave? If you do, you need to use 10-foot travel lanes. If you're not comfortable with that, then there won't be a bike lane. That's where you're at. You're at the minimum, and you're at a moment where you've got to choose bike lane or no bike lane. There isn't an in between. And they were all super uncomfortable with it at that time because, well, isn't a 10-foot lane dangerous and this and that? And I had to really wrote a 60-page memo to explain why it wasn't such a black and white decision for them of safe, not safe. And they ended up making the simple argument carried the day of, do you want a bike lane or not? Yes or no? Because that is the actual question on the table. And it got them to yes. And then with the backup memo, it gave them the comfort as engineers to sign off on it. And that was the highest crash corridor in the city. They had a safety problem for bicyclists. And then when you go to the advocacy community today, I'd be beat up for putting that design in today because it's a door zone bike lane. Well, it's a 5-foot bike lane. It's a 7-foot parking and a 10-foot travel lane on a busy arterial. You should lose your license bill for doing that. Well, my choice was no bike lane or this condition.
Well, so one of the things that's good about the guides is that you kind of provide a range. And you were talking about what you could do on Mass Avenue at the time, but now you have a range of kind of space that you can actually deploy for these implementations. So I think that's an important part of this too, is like you're giving people a range of options, and there's an optimal option, but then there's the one you can do the least with, and then there's like the best one as well.
Yeah, and I think that's an area I'm really proud of AASHTO, and AASHTO's really pumped about this too, is that this guide is their first guide that really digs into this concept of a range in a deeper way, that the 12-foot lane is short a number, but 11 and a half is almost as good as 12. Like that there's this continuum, like we really put that into the guide. So yeah, a door zone bike lane, not great. Like we'd all agree. If I didn't have to do that, I'd love it, but it's better than not doing it. And now we're able to communicate to the readers of the guide that nuance, that difference, so that it isn't all or nothing and that you don't throw your hands up. Well, I can't do the protected bike lane. Guess I'll do nothing. Because you have some personalities and people that think that way, or they are fearful and like, well, if I can't do the perfect, I'm not doing anything. And it becomes paralyzing. Like we're just not in that kind of a society. Like we're a society that iteratively makes changes and you hope for the best in each outcome you have, each project, but you aren't always able to get there. So you got to do the best you can with whatever constraints you're in. So this guide really directs the reader with that way of thinking about it, which is really powerful.
One thing I wrote down when I was looking through them yesterday was the guides can do a lot of things, but one of the things that they really can't do is political will. They can't create it. And it's not something that they can just pull out of thin air. But what do you think about that idea of political will and how much it takes from people to make these decisions to actually go forward with designing bikeways or designing bike networks?
I'm glad you brought that up too, because before this guide was out, I mean, AASHTO and NACTO are complementary, but at the end of the day, if you're spending federal money and state money, AASHTO is a notch above NACTO as far as what the resource we're going to hang our hat on for engineers in particular. So now that the AASHTO guide is updated for bikeways, you no longer have the excuse, well, it's not in the guide, I can't do it. It's everything you can imagine is in that guide. The METCD, it's not perfect, but it's updated. So the design guidance today allows you to do just about anything you need to do to create a safer environment. Now the issue is 100% political. Now it's more clearly, you've simplified in a way, you've taken some of the layers of I can't out of the equation. It's more I won't, or I can't because the mayor won't let me, or I can't because the business owner, or, but it is politics now. I think that's good, because now the engineers' hands are untied with design guidance. What I say to them now is you can't ignore the politics. You've got to become an educator. You've got to go out as an engineer and expert and explain to people the choices before them so that they can make an informed decision to try to help with the political side of the equation. Don't hide from it because everything in transportation is political because it affects everybody. And everyone, like we were saying at the beginning, everyone has an opinion about it because they all experience it. So you can't be a silent partner in that process. You've got to come out and explain the facts. Bike lanes improve safety. The road diet is important because we have a crash problem, so your preemption bill saying no more road diets in the state is harmful. More people are going to be killed. There's going to be more crashes as a result of that policy choice. We need to be out there defending our profession, and we need to help educate people about what we need to do in our design to get better outcomes. I think it's incumbent upon us to do that.
I've got a couple more questions if you'll indulge me.
Sure.
I feel like these guides are kind of subchapters in the larger discussion about sustainable planning and transportation. There's like a lot of big discussions going on about the future of mobility, on climate action, on other urban policies that color the way that we see these guides. I'm wondering how these fit into kind of that larger discussion, because these are obviously guides for bike design, for doing this specific thing, but they're part of the larger constellation of things that we want to have happen. How does this fit into that larger discussion about sustainability writ large?
Well, it's totally there. It's always been there. Like we've always said, at Toole, we see it, and you see it in the results around the world, but like a bike-friendly community is a safer community. It's more sustainable. It doesn't mean Joe 10 miles out of town is biking to work. It doesn't mean I'm forcing you out of your car. It doesn't mean you're going to go to the grocery store 15 times a day to get the 15 bags of groceries you want, right? Like those absurd edge cases that people bring up in a public meeting of like why biking doesn't work for them and 100% of the trips they want to make. What we're really at, what we see in these bike networks is now in DC, I've watched it personally as we densified, added 150,000 residents that weren't here when I moved here in 1999. At the same time, we've reduced lanes of traffic all over the place, added bus lanes. We now got a connected bike network. We still have mobility. Like you can get around and it's safer. We can provide a higher quality of life for not only the 500,000 people that lived here before, but the 150,000 new people, which allowed us to get all this new density and all the benefits that we love from that. Like now we got cool restaurants to go to and more bars and sports stadiums and all that stuff that didn't exist when I moved here because we didn't have the money for it. We didn't have the population to sustain it all. We had a lot of vacant parking lots, so it just didn't make sense. So it is a huge component of the sustainability bucket, even if only 10% of your people are using the thing, which biking still is in the scheme. We're not the Netherlands. You don't see 50% mode share, but 10, 15%. And then we have some neighborhoods in DC where you can get upwards of 20% of people biking. But we also have a lot more people in transit, a lot more people walking because it contributes to the overall climate of a safer multimodal system. It's kind of the indicator bird, like it's that canary in the coal mine. A bike-friendly community is a city that's doing a lot of things well, is what we see.
You've talked about this guide a lot for 10 years, and you've probably discussed it in a lot of podcasts and things like that. Is there something that people don't ask you that you wish they would?
I mean, the 10 years is a tricky one, right? It was really like 4 years of hard work, and then it was it's many
10
years of waiting for the process to play out and the reviews, and then we had to pause it, waiting for the METCD to be updated. I really can't think of anything. I love the history part that we brought into it. I think it was something that people didn't know. Like there was different places it's been discussed. It wasn't like some secret. I didn't discover it. It has been talked about in a couple books even. But what was really a fun moment for me was taking that paper we wrote on the history of bikeway design guidance and presenting it at TRB in front of, 300 people. And now I've weaved that into all my trainings, actually, as I start out all of our bikeway design trainings and even street design trainings of like, you need to understand a little of the history of why our roads look the way they do to understand how we got here so we can think about how we get out of this. But also so you can recognize where bias existed in past design guidance that you may not have been aware of that infiltrates your job. And I'd say that's the one thing that's kind of a value add that came out of this that was unexpected for me to do, that has been really impactful in a way that I didn't expect, People love that little 5 minute. I mean, it depends on the venue I'm in. It could be 5 minutes or 20-minute overview on this, but it's always one that I get a lot of like interesting feedback on, that people are like, that was amazing. Like, I had no idea, and I find that there's a division in planners who are taught about redlining and all the stuff that the engineers did that was horrible, in the 50s and 60s of destroying cities and bulldozing neighborhoods with their highways. But the fact of the matter is the engineers are not taught that at all. So there's a huge gap in our profession where in planning school, that's a component of the education system. But in engineering, the history of our profession is not discussed, with the exception of the era of bribery, where like in our ethics class, where they talk about the paving contractor paying off the engineer for the highway job they're doing in the 60s, but like that's it. And it's a real, I think that's a problem. I think it hurts our ability to educate the public in myth. Well, when they were called social engineers, like, yeah, we have been forever. My bike lane is not a social engineering project. Like, everything we're out here is a social engineering project. The legislature banning road diets is a social engineering exercise, So I think knowing some of that history, it empowers us to be able to speak more comfortably in this space, that we've been a missing voice in politics that I think we need to kind of start to learn about. I think it would help us know the safety crisis of our roads. Like, we've created a very dangerous system. And what I say is we got to be a lot more transparent about it, so that then people can make more informed decisions. Like, okay, fine, you don't want to do the right thing. Expect 10 more people to die next year, which could be your friends, your family, your neighbors. But like, that's going to happen. Or we could do this, and I can tell you that we're going to save 20 or 30 people's lives. Like, some more facts. We're because of the liability thing, we're very afraid to, I say, just tell the truth. Just tell people what the consequences are of these. That's our job. They can be the participant in making that decision, but right now people aren't making informed choices because they don't have all the facts. Our job is to put all the facts in front of people to make smarter choices.
I just talked with Alexis Madrigal about his book, The Pacific Circuit. He wrote this book about the Pacific Circuit, which ties together the fortunes of West Oakland, which is where the port is, and basically all of the wars that we had had in Asia, all of the sweatshops and microchip foundries that we set up over there, and then had the shipping lanes come back, and it all came back to Oakland, but the wealth didn't come back to West Oakland specifically. Right. And he ties that into a discussion about this wonderful Black leader in West Oakland who basically throughout her whole life, she was kicked out of her houses because of highways or because of port creation or because redlining or whatever it may be. There were 3 different times that basically she moved somewhere and then she got kicked out of her house. Now she's a leader in West Oakland in their environmental justice community. And reading that book and then seeing that juxtaposed with the discussion about abundance and Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book, I appreciate their view, but I feel like Alexis's book is almost more important than theirs because it talks about the history of where places like West Oakland got to where they are and why they're there now. And it's because of our kind of industrialism. It's because of the decisions we made in the past. And it gives you kind of a history so that you can figure out a way to move forward. Whereas just telling people to build stuff and it's not working right doesn't seem to work for me for some reason. And so I think that that's kind of an interesting connection to what you're talking about, which is like, in order to understand what we need to do in the future, we need to look into the past. And I've always loved history. My dad was a history major. My sister was a history major in school. And so it's always been something. And I didn't go into history because I knew that they didn't get jobs in history. And so I went to geography instead and started making maps and doing cartography and stuff before I went to planning school. But I find that that's really an important part of this whole thing is like, we all don't know all this history because there's so much of it. And so anytime we can get little pieces of it, people are appreciative of that. And I think that you going to meetings and telling people even a little bit of history is just the most beneficial thing because there's a lot of folks that might not have heard it yet.
I think that's it. And I've made, again, a standard practice to bring in resources. So like the most impactful book I read was The Color of Law, which really hit home for me of the impact of redlining in a way that it just, you could talk about it, but not understand it. That book helped me really understand it. And then you start to see it. And then I was able to tie it into the highway expansion and why are all the streets one way in downtowns throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s. I was undoing some of those in the early part of my career, but like this White Flight by Kevin Cruz is another book that was amazingly powerful for me, of like Atlanta, Georgia, the White Flight, because he tied it to like one community and really made you understand it. And I was able to like, there were like places I went to, so I could really make it work. So I'd bring those into trainings, and then I would explain, well, this is what happened here in the state I was in. I happened to be Michigan. And I remember this training I did, the city engineer came up and said, well, your streets were one way so that people could come in, and it wasn't the people who fled the city and took their wealth out, and then they wanted the benefits. And so you as a city traffic engineer, not you, but like there was a culture of the city working for the people who left. And their constituents were not the residents, but the people who left and abandoned them. And you did everything in your power to try to entice them in any small way you could to get them back, catered them at the expense of everyone living there. You were in service to all this stuff, even if you didn't understand it. And it's funny because the city engineer came up to me after he said, I had no idea about any of that. He said, honestly, when you started talking, I felt personally attacked. Like his instinct was to get super defensive, because what I was saying is like when you're optimizing the timing for the commuters and all this stuff, like you're really favoring this other constituency over your residents. And he didn't see his job that way because he didn't understand the history of that. He's like, well, my job's to serve the business and the residents and all that. And it's a balance. But at the end of it, he's able to realize how out of balance it was, and how there was that full history that he hadn't considered the impact of that, and like the safety crisis on those roads, impacting his residents and not the out of town visitors, like he came around. But I think some of these preemption laws we're seeing are this defensiveness from a source of not understanding where this comes from. Or for ones that do know, resource hoarding. I mean, it's just outright like, I protect what my team has. I want to hurt those people. Yeah. It's good for me. So I think that's a tougher place, but I don't think most people operate that way. I think a lot of people just don't know.
Yeah. I think a lot of people don't know. Well, I feel like I could talk with you for hours and hours and hours about all this stuff, but I do want folks to take a look at the guides. So where can folks find more information about the new AASHTO bike guide? And for the NACTO guide, people can go to Island Press, can get it at their local bookstores, but AASHTO might be a little bit harder to grab.
You got to go to AASHTO. So they're the publisher. They have the copyright. That's why I can't share it freely as much as I'd love to. Transportation.org is the AASHTO website. They have a bookstore. It is expensive because it's really written for the professional designers doing these projects. And for you and I paying, $500 or $300 for a book would feel outrageous unless it was like a historic one of a kind. But in the scheme of what it is, it's a reasonable price for what it's doing. What it does do is it puts it out of reach for a lot of advocacy groups. My recommendation is, pay the money, like donate it. Once you bought it, you own it. Donate it to a library. Make it accessible for more people. Go to your DOT. Would they donate one to you? I mean, I think ask. And that you don't get what you don't ask for. Something I like to say a lot. Every DOT doesn't have an excuse. They have a budget that can afford buying these books. The staff should have access to them. They should own them. Your local city should own them. Ask them if they could donate one to the public library. That would be a great way for others that it's beyond their means to have access to be able to look at it. And I think that's a reasonable request, would be my recommendation.
I love that because I had Leah Rothstein on a couple of weeks ago talking about the follow-up to The Color of Law, which is called Just Action. And to do that, I actually rented from my library The Color of Law initially to listen to it. So I'd listen to the audiobook through the library before, so I could do that and then read Just Action after it. So yeah, the local library is a huge resource for all kinds of stuff.
Huge.
So that would be a great idea. I'd love it. And then you're at Toole Design. Where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
TooleDesign.com. I mean, we're on our website. We've got an amazing team. We've got offices throughout the United States. We're really proud of our work. I'm really proud of our staff. They're out there doing these projects every single day in communities that your listeners are living in, I'm sure. So you see our work. You may not know it's our work, but it is everywhere. It's really been a fantastic place to work.
Awesome. Well, Bill, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our 18-year-old daily newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com or check the show notes for other cool merch and opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find the show at its original home, usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.